It's 100 CE. You're standing in a rented room on the third floor of an insula in Rome, and it is the 8th day since your child was born. You're holding a small hollow amulet on a leather cord, a bulla, because in about an hour you're supposed to hang it around your baby's neck and finally give the kid a name. Nobody in this room has slept properly in over a week. It smells like lamp oil and boiled wool. And you keep glancing at the door, half expecting someone to walk in and tell you this whole ceremony is premature. A week ago, on the day your child was actually born, nobody here was confident the baby would still be around for a naming at all. That's not modern anxiety projected backward onto ancient people. That is just what having a baby in Rome was like. Somewhere between a quarter and half of Roman children never reached adulthood, and a huge share of that dying happened in the first days and weeks before anybody had even bothered to give the kid a name, which is a strange way to run a civilization if you stop and think about it. Rome built roads that are still standing. Rome moved water across mountains on stone arches. And Rome could not reliably keep its own babies alive past their first week without help from a doctor, a paid stranger, and a piece of bronze. Here's the part that should catch you off guard. Rome wasn't stumbling around blind on this. By the time your child was born, Rome had trained midwives and a formal medical literature on childbirth. It had wet nurses working under paid contracts, and doctors writing detailed manuals on exactly what a healthy newborn was supposed to look like. This wasn't guesswork dressed up as medicine. Some of it genuinely worked and worked well. And yet, none of that changed the basic fact that giving birth was one of the most dangerous things a Roman woman could do, and that surviving your first year as a Roman baby was closer to a coin flip than any parent wants to hear. The gap between how much Rome actually knew and how little that knowledge could save is the whole story of what you're about to sit through. And it gets stranger before it gets clearer. Some of what protected a Roman infant was real medicine, some of it was a bronze charm on a cord, and some of it was a law that let your own father decide, on the day you were born, whether you got to live at all. So today, we're going through all of it. The test a total stranger ran on your child before you were even allowed to hold it. The 8th day ceremony and the amulet that came with it. The woman hired for actual money to feed a baby that wasn't hers. The evil eye that every household in Rome was quietly terrified of. And the one legal power a Roman father had that could end this whole story before it started. By the end, you're going to understand why a bronze charm on a leather cord felt less like superstition and more like the only insurance policy on the market. Let's go. Here's the thing nobody tells you about how we know any of this. It isn't guesswork stitched together from tombstones and vibes. Around 100 CE, a Greek physician named Soranus, working in Rome, wrote a 4-book manual called the Gynecology, and Book 2 is essentially a field guide to keeping a newborn alive. It survives today because Byzantine scribes kept recopying it for centuries, long after the original scrolls had crumbled. It now sits in a single medieval manuscript in a library in Florence. Soranus wasn't writing philosophy. He was writing instructions a working midwife could follow the same afternoon. What cry sounds healthy? What limbs should do when you move them? What shape a skull should be? Somebody wrote this down because somebody needed to actually use it. At the bedside, on a baby that might not survive the hour. We only have it because a chain of anonymous copyists, one after another, kept deciding it was worth the vellum. I find that oddly moving, honestly. Hold that thought, because the moment this checklist gets used on your own child is going to come back at the end. And it's going to hit harder than you expect. You're probably picturing this as fatalism dressed up in a toga. The assumption most of us carry around, is that ancient parents just accepted infant death as background noise, the cost of doing business in a world without antibiotics. Nobody, we assume, was really examining a newborn with any rigor at all. That assumption feels reasonable. No hospitals, no incubators, no germ theory. Why would anyone bother checking a baby over like a piece of equipment before deciding to keep it? Wouldn't you just take what you got and hope? That's certainly how we tend to picture it whenever a documentary shows us a mud floor and a resigned-looking mother. We assume the poorer the tools, the lower the standards. Except that's not remotely what they did, and the checking was disturbingly specific. Soranus instructed the midwife to confirm the baby's cry was strong and clear, comparable to a young goat's, that its limbs bent and straightened without stiffness or paralysis, that its head, shoulders, and torso sat in proportion, and that every orifice was open and unobstructed. Only after passing that inspection was the newborn considered worth raising at all. And here's the number that should sit uncomfortably with you. Historian Tim Parkin, in his 1992 study Demography in Roman Society, calculated that somewhere between 25 and 35% of Roman infants died within their first year, and as many as half never reached adulthood. Rome wasn't guessing at any of this. Rome was running a formal medical assessment on a population it already knew. Statistically, it was going to lose in enormous numbers. We are not talking about a rare tragedy that occasionally touched a household. We are talking about the baseline expectation everyone in that room was quietly doing math around. Let's start with the floor, because everything else depends on it. A Roman baby was not born into someone's arms. The midwife delivered it, cut and tied the cord, wiped it down, and then set it directly onto the ground. Usually a packed earth or tiled floor still cold and slightly damp from the birth itself. That was not neglect. That was procedure, and every adult in the room understood exactly what it meant. The infant lay there, alone on the floor of a room that smelled like blood, oil lamps, and boiled herbs, while the midwife ran through Soranus's checklist in real time, out loud, so the family could hear each item pass or fail as she said it. There was no curtain drawn over this part, no private room down a hallway. Everyone who mattered to that household was standing close enough to hear the verdict land, which meant there was no version of the outcome that stayed quiet. She listened to the cry first because a weak or strange cry ended the inspection early. Then she flexed each limb and let it go, watching how it sprang back, checking the mouth, nostrils, and ears for a clear passage, confirming the anus wasn't sealed, comparing the proportions of head to shoulders to torso against what she'd seen on healthy babies for years. This took minutes, not seconds. We know from Soranus's own text that midwives were expected to have delivered enough children to make this comparison instinctively, which means the woman kneeling over your baby had likely seen this exact moment fail before, more than once, in other rooms just like this one. I don't think we give that enough credit. This wasn't a random neighbor guessing. It was a trained professional applying the same standards she'd applied dozens of times. To your child specifically, on the worst morning of your life so far. Only after she gave her verdict did anyone else touch the child. If the baby passed, she handed it to the father, and the father physically lifted it off the ground himself. A gesture with a name, Tollere Liberos, to raise the child. That lift was the actual acceptance, not the birth. The lift, skip it. And by Roman custom and law, nobody was under any obligation to feed, name, or keep that baby at all. Which means the single most important decision in a Roman child's life happened before it had a name, before it had a blanket, while it was lying on cold ground being timed by a stranger. Which brings us to the strangest object in the whole story, because passing the floor test only bought you 8 more days before the next one. That next date was the dies lustricus, the day of purification, held on the 8th day for a girl and the 9th for a boy. The Greek writer Plutarch, who spent time in Rome and wrote about its customs directly, explains the 1-day gap. He claims girls simply matured faster than boys, which tells you more about Roman assumptions than it does about biology. Until this day, a Roman baby wasn't fully treated as a person. It didn't have a name. Family gathered in the house, incense burned. Small offerings were made to the household gods, and only then did an adult formally announce the child's praenomen out loud for the first time, in front of witnesses who would remember hearing it for the rest of their lives. A baby that had been alive for over a week still hadn't been introduced to its own household as somebody with a name. We tend to assume a name is the very first thing a newborn gets. In Rome, it was something you earned by surviving 8 or 9 full days first. This was also the day the bulla went on, and the amulet itself has a documented origin. Pliny the Elder, writing in Natural History Book 33, around 77 CE, credits the custom to Tarquinius Priscus, an early Roman king who gave his underage son a gold amulet after the boy killed an enemy in battle. From there, it became standard for freeborn children, though what you actually got depended entirely on your family's money. Wealthy households hung a hollow gold locket, maybe 4 centimeters across, a little under 2 inches, small enough to close inside a child's fist. Poorer families used leather pouches or plain lead and bronze instead. Either way, something went around the child's neck that day and did not come off again for years. It's worth pausing on that last part. We're used to protective objects being optional, something you can take off when it's inconvenient. This one wasn't. It stayed on through baths, through fevers, through every ordinary scrape of a Roman childhood, because removing it, even for an afternoon, felt like removing the only thing standing between your child and whatever was watching. Here's what was actually inside it and why anyone bothered. The bulla wasn't decorative. It was sealed, often with small protective charms or herbs packed inside, worn specifically against fascinatio, the evil eye, which Romans across every social class genuinely believed could sicken or kill a child through nothing more than an envious glance. You'd feel it constantly. A small, hard weight bumping against a bare chest while a child crawled. Knocked against furniture, dragged through dust. It stayed on day and night. Through illness, through play, through every ordinary danger a Roman childhood contained. Because taking it off, even briefly, meant taking off the only protection anyone could offer against a threat nobody could see coming. Would you have believed in it? Probably not if you'd grown up anywhere else. But grow up surrounded by adults who treat a stranger's stare as a real medical threat. And I'd argue you'd be reaching for bronze too. And here's the detail that should stop you cold. Even after the ceremony, even wearing the bulla, a Roman infant still wasn't guaranteed a full death, if it came to that. Pliny records in that same book that it was universal Roman custom not to cremate a child who died before cutting its teeth, meaning roughly the first 6 months. No pyre, no urn, no headstone. Those infants were called arpagi, and they were buried quietly under the eaves of the house instead of in a cemetery. Without a funeral anyone would have recognized as one. You could survive the floor. You could survive the naming. You could be wearing bronze against the evil eye. And your own culture still hadn't fully decided you counted as a person yet. Sit with that for a second, because it's easy to skim past. Personhood in Rome had a schedule. It arrived in stages, with paperwork, and teeth were one of the checkpoints. Let's talk about the father's power, because this is where modern people get squeamish, and the Romans simply wrote it down. The floor test wasn't a one-time event limited to the hour after birth. Roman law, going back to the 12 tables of roughly 450 BCE, addressed it directly. Cicero quotes the relevant line centuries later in his own work. On the Laws, Book 3, Section 8, a child visibly and severely deformed was to be killed quickly. Not hidden, not euphemized. Written into the earliest law code Rome ever produced, in plain language, as a father's recognized authority over a household he legally owned outright. Doesn't it matter that this sat in Rome's founding legal text, not tucked away in some obscure commentary? We're not talking about a rumor historians pieced together from gossip. We're talking about a line ordinary Roman school children were later made to memorize. Because for centuries, the 12 tables were how you learned to read law at all. In practice, killing wasn't the only option, and it may not have been the common one. Unwanted infants were often left somewhere public instead, and Rome had an actual known site for this. The Roman grammarian Festus, writing around the 2nd century CE, describes a landmark in the produce market called the Columna Lactaria, the milk column, so named because infants were brought there to be given milk. Scholars still argue over exactly what that means. It may have been a charity feeding point for struggling parents. It may have been the place you went to find a wet nurse for hire. It may have doubled as a recognized unofficial drop-off point for a baby its family could not or would not keep. The column stood in the Forum Holatorium until it was demolished in the 40s BCE to make room for the Theater of Marcellus, a building you can still visit in Rome today, standing on top of a landmark most tourists have never heard of. And this is the part worth sitting with instead of flinching from. A baby left at that column wasn't necessarily left to die. Strangers picked infants up, sometimes to raise as their own, more often to raise as enslaved labor. And the same hired wet nursing industry that fed wanted children fed these ones too. For a fee, no questions asked about how they gotten there. It's a strange kind of safety net, built on exactly the same indifference that made it necessary in the first place. We like our history sorted into villains and victims. Rome keeps refusing to give us that. The same column that could mean abandonment could also mean a second chance with a different family entirely, and nobody standing in that market that day could have told you which one you were watching happen. Now let's talk about Rome's Edge, because that's where one of these stories actually survived with a name attached. In Cologne, in what was then the Roman colony of Colonia Claudia Aura Agrippinensium on the northern frontier, a small limestone gravestone was carved sometime in the 2nd or 3rd century CE. It's short, plain, and functional, the kind of marker an ordinary family could afford, not a senator's monument. The inscription says a father named Lucius Cassius Tacitus set it up for his child, who lived 9 days. 9. Which means this baby died the day before, or the very day of the dies lustricus, the exact naming ceremony from earlier in this video. It is, as far as the surviving record shows, the youngest child ever formally commemorated on a Roman tombstone. We have thousands of Roman funerary inscriptions, and almost none of them belong to a child this young. Most families in this position, on the frontier, with a fraction of a senator's money, simply couldn't or didn't spend on stone for 9 days of life. Lucius Cassius Tacitus did anyway. The stone is still there today in the Römisch Germanisches Museum, and you can walk up and read it yourself. And here's where I have to be honest with you, because this channel does not fake certainty. Epigraphers who've studied the Latin closely aren't fully agreed on what the child's name even was. The word carved on the stone, read one way, gives a name. Read another way, grammatically, it's simply the Latin term for a child born into the household, no name attached at all. Which means Lucius Cassius Tacitus may have buried a son he never got the chance to formally name in front of witnesses, and carved a stone for him anyway. You, standing in that rented room on day 8 with a bronze amulet in your hand, were rehearsing a ceremony this specific father never got to finish. I keep coming back to the fact that he carved the stone anyway, uncertainty and all, because it meant something to mark that this child had existed, name or no name. Now, let's be precise about where the solid ground actually ends, because this channel doesn't pretend to know more than the evidence supports. That 25 to 35% first-year mortality figure isn't a census. Rome never counted its dead babies systematically. Historians reconstruct the number instead from comparable pre-industrial populations, skeletal remains, and the small slice of families wealthy enough to leave inscriptions at all, which almost certainly undercounts the poorest households by a wide margin. We genuinely don't know how often fathers actually invoked their legal right to reject a newborn, versus how often that power sat unused. More threat than daily practice. And we don't know for certain whether the columna lactaria was a charity, a hiring post, or a drop-off point. Because one grammarian writing centuries later is the only source we have for it at all. That's thin evidence for a claim this specific. And I'd rather tell you that plainly than pretend a single surviving sentence settles the question. None of that uncertainty erases the pattern underneath it, though. The law existed. The mortality was real, even if the exact number moves depending who's counting. The amulet was real. The stone in Cologne is real, and you can go look at it yourself. Rome built an entire apparatus, legal, medical, and religious, around a problem it could describe in precise detail and only partly solve. And I think that combination is the most honest thing about how this culture actually worked. We don't need a perfect number to understand what that meant for the people living through it. So go back to that rented room on the 8th day, the amulet in your hand. The smell of lamp oil and boiled wool, you already know what that moment actually was now. It wasn't a cute family tradition. It was a father hanging bronze around his child's neck, a midwife's checklist, a set of household gods, and a piece of metal from an Etruscan custom were genuinely the best defense Rome had, and everyone in that room understood exactly how often it failed. Hold that thought from earlier, because here it is, hitting the way I promised it would. Somewhere in the empire, on that exact same day, another father was carving 9 days into a stone instead of a name into a family record. Both men did everything the culture told them to do. Only one of them got to keep his kid. We still do a version of this, whether we notice it or not. The hospital bracelet, the baby monitor on the nightstand, the little evil eye charm someone's grandmother insists on pinning to a stroller. Different tools, dressed up in different materials, but the same fear running underneath all of them, unbroken for 2,000 years. Nobody actually outgrew the bulla. We just stopped calling it that. We just don't have to write 9 days on a stone quite as often anymore. And it's worth remembering that this is a genuinely new privilege, not a permanent feature of being human. So, question for you. If bronze on a cord was genuinely the best odds on offer, would you have trusted it, or would you have kept waiting for something better that wasn't coming? Let me know in the comments. Until then, see you soon.